Today, we are joined by Melissa Dakers, Habitat and Stewardship Program Manager with Watersheds Canada. Melissa is going to be talking about Watersheds Canada and the work they do with local organizations to protect, enhance, and restore many types of freshwater fish habitat. In particular, she will be outlining the step-by-step protocols that community groups, youth, property owners, and concerned individuals can use to assess the quality of their local fish habitat, and if needed, select a suitable project to ensure their local populations of fish, turtles, invertebrates, and other freshwater species stay healthy for years to come.
Good morning. Thank you for joining me. I know the last 2 days across Ontario have been kind of crazy. I live near Perth, Ontario, and we got almost 50 centimeters of snow yesterday. So we're still digging out, but I'm so glad that so many of you could join me today to talk about enhancing and restoring local fish habitat. My focus is in Ontario, but a lot of these procedures and steps can definitely be taken into other areas. And I make note of that throughout my presentation, some of the differences. So like I said, we'll be giving you a glimpse about enhancing and restoring fish habitat and using our fish habitat enhancement toolkit and protocols that we developed last year. As mentioned before, if you have any questions, throw them into the chat. Allison will be keeping tabs on them, and then I'll address them at the end of the presentation. So, okay. So today I'm going to just talk a bit about, give you a brief overview about the problems facing Canada's freshwater. I'll introduce you to Watersheds Canada in case you haven't heard about who we are and what we do. And we'll also be looking at how fish populations can be restored through community stewardship enhancement projects. And we'll take a closer look at cold water creek and shoreline restoration projects, also adding woody debris or brush bundles back into your lake, and also spawning bed enhancement. We hear it every day in the media. The world is being affected by climate change. The weather patterns are changing. Yesterday was a big example. We are seeing more flash flooding, increased precipitation in shorter amounts of time. Development is also at an ultimate high, especially with the pandemic. We're seeing more and more people being able to work from home, and more people are wanting to move to waterfront properties and ultimately developing those critical pieces of habitat. And I think this quote says a lot here from the World Wildlife Federation. Canada's freshwater ecosystems are in trouble. All 160 sheds are under threat, and wildlife that rely on freshwater are also under threat. We've gone from seeing natural, fully vegetated, healthy shorelines to this. Mowed lawns to the water's edge. Now, some of you may be asking, why is this a problem? It looks nice and neat and tidy. Well, this area is known as the riparian zone, or the ribbon of life. And it is what fish and wildlife depend on the most. Owners will tell you that the #1 reason that they came to the lake was because of the waterfront. They want to swim, they want to fish, they want a canoe or boat, and they love being able to see wildlife. Well, but many people are trying to bring the city to the lake, and they're cutting down the trees because they want the view, and they're planting lawns. But in the process, they're jeopardizing critical habitat and the health of the land and of the water. With the steady increase in development along Canada's lakes and rivers, critical fish habitat is being compromised and degraded. So we must educate people and work together to help protect our precious natural resources. Now, what you're seeing here in this photo is an outbreak of toxic blue-green algae, and it's caused by nutrient loading or an abundance of phosphorus, extremely warm fall temperatures, and no wind. And that right combination produces this deadly algae bloom. And we're seeing this more and more across Ontario and on our cottage lakes. So let's start back on land. Like I mentioned before, healthy fish populations depend on healthy shorelands, not just shorelines. Throughout various life cycles, up to 90% of fish and wildlife species depend on a healthy shoreland. They utilize this area for sources of food, shelter, migration, breeding, and rearing of their young. Now, some of you may be thinking, land? Fish live in the water, but many sources of food, for example, insects or amphibians, are food sources for some of those fish. Also, when it rains, the water runs off straight into the rivers and lakes. And if the surface is hard, like paved or impermeable, it runs straight in. So by making a few changes to waterfront properties, we are able to actually decrease the amounts of pollutants and nutrients from entering the water. Here are some easy things you can do to improve this critical habitat. Start by curving your pathways to the water and using materials that are permeable. This will allow the water to filter into the ground before it runs straight into the lake. Planting shorelines with native vegetation will not only prevent erosion because their roots hold on to the soils, they help filter that runoff. Pardon me, I didn't mean that to be ringing. So yeah, the roots hold on to the soils. They help filter the runoff and using the nutrients on the land before they enter the waterway. They also provide food sources and shade to the fish and wildlife species, keeping water temperatures cooler. So native vegetated shorelands are the #1 thing that anyone can do to restore both terrestrial and aquatic habitats. Okay. So before I continue with restoring fish habitat, I want to introduce you to the organization that I have had the pleasure of working with since 2015, Watersheds Canada. We're a small but mighty organization located in Perth, Ontario, Canada, and we're about an hour west of Ottawa. We are federally incorporated and a nonprofit organization, as well as a national registered Canadian charity. We have been developing and providing stewardship programs in the communities for over 20 years, including our Natural Edge planting program and app, and our Love Your Lake assessment, shoreline assessment program in partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. We partner and connect with local groups at all levels, taking time to understand the needs to ensure that our programs are specific and impactful. We envision people caring for their waters, resulting in clean, healthy lakes and rivers that will support humans, fish, and wildlife for years to come. In partnership with local organizations, Watersheds Canada works to protect, enhance, and restore many types of freshwater fish habitat, including walleye and trout spawning beds, shorelands along cold water creeks, and underwater cover by adding woody debris or brush bundles. Sorry, my phone just, I put that on mute. Okay, next slide, here we go. So last year we launched the Fish Habitat Enhancement Toolkit that we developed in partnership with the Lanark County Stewardship Council, and it's based on projects that have been completed over the last several years. It provides community groups with step-by-step instructions on how to complete a successful fish habitat enhancement project. Oops. So some of you might be wondering, what is a fish habitat enhancement toolkit? Well, it's a set of resources that provide easy to follow written guidelines and videos to plan and implement a successful fish habitat project. Now, I've received questions about these resources and if they can be used in other provinces. Yes, they can, but please note that these documents do outline the key authorities and the permitting process here in Ontario, Canada. So you would have to contact your local authorities in your area regarding the rules and regulations for fish habitat and in-water work before you begin. Okay, so each protocol walks you through the project, starting with useful information about the project, the planning, the implementation, and evaluating your success at the end. We discuss whom to contact, key stakeholders, local authorities in Ontario, fundraising, and creating a budget for your project, as well as conducting a site visit and the permitting process. These resources also give you a great reference at the end. There's a resource page for Ontario of local contacts and who you can call to work on a project. All right, so before starting a fish habitat enhancement project, you should consult our guide. So we created a new toolkit guide, and it introduces different types of fish habitat projects, provides additional resources in order to complete them. So it'll give you a really good overview and introduction to all the types of projects. And once you've identified your objectives and the type of project you're interested in, you can then refer to the protocol manuals and the videos associated with them. These will go into just some further details and lay out the steps needed to complete a successful fish habitat enhancement project. So let's introduce you to all the different types of projects that we've been involved with. So the first one is our cold water creek enhancement. Cold water creeks are fed by groundwater and they remain cold all year. These creeks often flow during dry periods because they're not dependent upon precipitation or other surface water. Cold water creeks are generally less than 19 degrees Celsius, and healthy creeks have native vegetation along their banks. There's fast flowing waters, and the habitats include areas of riffles, pools, and runs. So it's fast and slow and fast, and so there's different areas for species like brook trout to live in. With the decline of cold water creeks in Ontario due to land use development and climate change, and the fact that Lanark County, where I do a lot of work, has only 5 cold water creeks, there was a need to enhance these critical brook trout habitats in this area. On cold water creeks, our main focus has been on naturalizing shorelands and the shorelines with some larger native tree species such as silver maple and black willow. These are very fast growing trees. They like their feet wet, so being next to a creek is a great idea, and they will provide really great shade to this creek. By planting the shoreline or the riparian zone, we are stabilizing the creek banks and we're preventing erosion and siltation of the creek. And like I mentioned before, we're providing shade to the creek in order to maintain or lower the water temperatures. We placed cardboard, paper, brown paper bags, and coconut fiber mats at the base of each tree to help prevent competition with the surrounding grasses. And we staked and caged each of these trees for a few years to allow them to establish and to prevent predation from beaver or deer. It gives them a bit of an extra fighting chance. So the next one is our in-water brush piles and woody debris. So it's known by many different terms. Underwater woody debris is a healthy component of a lake environment. Sunken logs, trees, branches, or root balls provide in-water structure that is excellent habitat for wildlife, including fish, turtles, invertebrates, and much more. Brush piles can provide fish with a food source, as well as shaded areas to rest, spawn, and escape predators. They also improve water quality by reducing suspended sediments in the water. So if you have a wave going by, it'll hit the brush bundle and the sediments will fall instead of spreading out in different areas. Beaver activity, wind, erosion, and water inflows from rivers and creeks, they naturally deposit these woody debris into a lake. However, human activity and development have significantly reduced the amount of natural woody debris in lakes. Many shorelines are getting cleaned up, and fallen trees are often removed from residential or cottage properties. They're not left to just stay in the water and become fish habitat. So communities can promote the health of fish and wildlife populations and improve water quality by creating additional woody debris habitat, such as in water brush piles or brush bundles. After determining the need for additional woody debris and site locations on a lake, we create and deploy brush bundles. So creating a brush bundle starts with gathering local brush, and it doesn't matter what type it is. It can be deciduous or coniferous, just a whole bunch of different types of brush. And we tie it together using a rope that is it's UV repellent, like it won't break down in the water, and it's very strong. And then we tie them to cinder blocks and multiple cinder blocks in order to anchor them and ensure that they stay in place once they are deployed. We don't want to create a hazard. Each bundle is placed in locations that are either deeper than 10 feet deep or back in bay areas so that it doesn't create a boating hazard to anyone. Sometimes we're able to access some old Christmas trees and anchor them to a cinder block, placing them in deeper water, creating an underwater forest. And that's what you see here with the boat. These two gentlemen are taking out some old Christmas trees that we had on Christie Lake. We then monitor the bundles during the summer for fish activity using underwater cameras and GPS coordinates that we acquired during the deployment, and we can see what types of species are using that area and also other wildlife. As mentioned before, the third type of project is walleye spawning bed enhancement. Walleye, also known as pickerel, as we were discussing earlier, are a highly prized sports fish and an important part of the biodiversity in many waters of Ontario. If you have walleye in your lake or river, you may be able to help strengthen their population by enhancing historic walleye spawning beds. Walleye spawning beds may need to be enhanced due to the deposit of sediment or algae on the rocks, or due to the loss of appropriate rock from high water levels or ice movement. And that's what happened in this picture here. This creek, it floods every year and has extremely high flow, and the area became very silted and they lost a lot of the appropriate rock, so we were adding it back in. So walleye beds are monitored for several years and have to fit the criteria for enhancement. After acquiring the necessary work permits, you may be able to add the washed river stone onto historic walleye spawning beds. The beds are then monitored, observing walleye spawning counts the following spring after the project was completed, and then for successful years to come, just to see how the population is improving and that they are using the beds. Sometimes you are able, So the protocol also outlines the steps for enhancing walleye spawning beds like before in the fall. or this project took place in the winter during the right conditions. So the lake has to have very little current and flow, and the area has to be stable on ice. And you can place washed river stone right on the ice and allow it to fall into the lake during the spring melt. These locations, like I mentioned, have no current, and they allow for less machinery use and more volunteer power. The protocol includes up-to-date permitting regulations as well by provincial authorities and in-depth instructions on how to complete this type of project. I will remind people, though, that this type of project requires many stakeholders and permits. You must involve the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry. Yes, they just changed their name, and I'm still trying to remember that one. As well as your local conservation authority. So you need to contact them in order to determine if your fish habitat project is in line with the local fish management plans, and that it goes for all fish habitat enhancement work. So let's look at some steps to planning your project. The overall steps are pretty straightforward and will be very similar for each type of project that I mentioned earlier. But we'll take a closer look at each step, and I'll provide some examples from the different types of projects. So the first two involve many of the same partners and organizations. So number one is research, and I can't stress this enough. Gather all available information on your local fishery from landowners, government agencies, and other agencies to even determine if your water body might benefit from a rehabilitation or an enhancement. A lot of the time, groups want to just do a project, but you need the justification from the experts and their partnership. So the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry, I think from now on, I'm just going to call them the ministry. Conservation authorities, like I mentioned, Fisheries and Oceans Canada is another one. They are the ones who manage our Ontario fisheries, and they collect population data. So this photo actually shows an example of Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority collecting fish population data by electrofishing this cold water creek for us to determine if brook trout were present. We knew that this creek was being stocked, but we wanted to see if there were other age classes still surviving in this habitat. So we looked at the different population classes to determine if they were the fingerlings from that year that was stocked, or the older age classes whom continue to use the habitat and to spawn. Okay, that one picture is a little blurry, but the simple act of collecting, oops, sorry, my notes got all screwed up here. So sorry, along with electrofishing, seine netting and broad scale netting are often used by the ministry and local conservation authorities as well to capture local fish population data. It gives them information on the species, age classes, abundance of local fisheries. They use this data as part of their fisheries management. So for example, broad scale netting is usually completed every 5 years on certain lakes. If they see walleye populations decreasing or no young age classes, they can use that information to study the spawning beds a little closer. Fish counts during spawning are often conducted as well. So comparing the number of fish observed year to year provides data to determine if the spawning beds are in need of an enhancement or a restoration. The ministry keeps track of the historical spawning beds for walleye and trout, and they often return, the fish often return to the same spawning bed year after year. So these counts are great indicators of the overall health of a population. Oops. So the simple act of collecting and monitoring water temperatures in multiple locations will also give you a lot of information about a water body, and it's pretty simple to do. Cold water creeks, as I mentioned before, are fed by groundwater, and they remain cold all year. So these creeks, because they flow during dry periods, are a great way to monitor the water temperatures. And the CAs will actually can use data loggers, and they'll put them into cold water creeks and collect data all year long. So that's another great resource that you can look into to see if there are areas along your creek that are showing temperatures above 19 degrees. So contact your local CA. They may already be monitoring an area that you are looking to enhance, and they may be looking for a partnership and community volunteers. And that leads me to number 2, which is consulting key stakeholders. So as mentioned in the last step, partnering with as many groups as possible, the ministry, the conservation authorities, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Watersheds Canada, stewardship councils, fish and game clubs, lake associations, Indigenous groups, and local residents, fishermen or fishing people. You want to involve everyone. When the partners are all at the table, the success of the project increases drastically. So this remains the same for every type of project. Also make sure to contact your local landowners, because you need to obtain permission to access project locations sometimes. Okay, determining your objective. So this comes from step 1 with your research, which you've already done. So what is the issue? What is the problem affecting the fish? Healthy fish populations depend on many factors, including food availability and structural habitat. These factors are often largely impacted by human activities. Alterations and development along the shorelines can damage fish habitat and reduce fish populations. So there are many things that people can do to enhance and restore these habitats and improve their local fisheries. So aquatic vegetation, such as water lilies and emergent plants, such as bulrushes or cattails, are also a key habitat feature for small fish and amphibians. Many people remove these plants as they want a beach-like swimming area. However, by pulling these weeds or aquatic vegetation, shoreline property owners are directly destroying primary habitat. The aquatic vegetation is important for fish and wildlife species, as it is used for shelter to escape predators, protection from sun, and food source. And please note, by removing aquatic vegetation, some areas do require permits to remove them. So please do not do this on your own. So let's look at a few examples of data collected from site visits and from our partners. So for this picture here, we've learned that this is a cold water creek, and it has brook trout from electrofishing data from our conservation authority. From a site visit, we have learned that there are areas that do not have trees on the bank. We've also, there is also bank erosion. And from the water temperature data that we've been collecting, the area is much warmer at 23 degrees Celsius than upstream, where it was only 15 degrees Celsius, and it is the middle of July. So our objective for this area would be to restore the area by planting native trees like black willow or silver maple. Both are fast growing and they require the wetter habitat. And they will help stabilize this shoreline. They'll provide shade to the creek, which will decrease the water temperatures, and it will increase the area of preferred habitat for the brook trout. So with this example, this creek has been flagged by the local outdoors club and by the Ontario Ministry as a historical walleye spawning bed. Data has shown that the local walleye numbers at the spawning bed, at the spawning, have been decreasing, and that the site visit, we observed that there is not enough rock, and what is that, the rock that is there is covered in silt. So the objective for this project is to add more washed river stone in varying sizes from 10 to 20 centimeters in diameter at this location. And the key thing to note is that you must use washed stone so that we're not adding more silt back into the water. Okay, so underwater footage collected on this lake has shown us many areas where there is very limited vegetation or woody debris. So after consulting our local authorities, we learned that the broad scale netting was showing a decrease in the abundance of fish being caught. So fish populations were dropping. Development has also increased on this lake. So it was decided that our objective would be to work with the community to add some brush bundles to a dozen sites on the lake in order to restore and enhance the fish habitat. Okay, so number 4, we want to choose your project site. So choosing a location obviously is based on many factors depending on the type of project, whether it is a historical spawning bed location, an area where vegetation has been removed or is lacking, an area that does not have woody debris nearby, or simply accessibility to an area. Talking with your stakeholders and your partners will allow you to choose the best location for your project. Making sure to include the local landowners and getting permission to access properties if needed is also a priority. Use local and expert knowledge. Site visits are a very important part of the process. Use local knowledge of property owners, of the local fishing community, and experts to determine which areas would best suit a restoration. Sorry. Also, public boat launches, which most lakes have, are often a great space to stage your project. Remember that besides the actual area to be restored, you need an area that allows for equipment access, parking for volunteers, space to have rock delivered. I learned this right off the bat. This location here is on White Lake, and we had to get a hi-ho down to the lake to be able to load this rock onto a barge, as well as launching the barge. So we had 3 spawning beds on this lake to complete. This one was closest to the creek back. You can see where the red trees are in the background. That's where our creek was. So being able to consult with the municipality and being able to use a public boat launch really helped get our project running smoothly. As previously mentioned, you need to figure out a budget for your project. Sorry, I'm on my wrong notes here. Sorry. So number 5, plan your project. I jumped ahead a bit. Planning your project and obtaining official permits. You have to do that first. So this step is critical for the success of your project. Each project is unique and involves different partnerships. The key point to realize is that fish habitat projects take time. They take time to research, they take time to plan, and they take time to execute. They don't happen overnight. And the more people realize this, the more successful a project can be. They always say that good things come to those who can wait and who are patient. You'll need to plan out when your project will take place. And this often depends on when certain species are spawning, when in-water work is allowed, how long it will take, how many volunteers you will need, what materials and equipment are needed, as well as creating a budget for your project. So projects are easier. Some projects are easier than others. Brush bundles or planting trees are not as involved as a spawning bed restoration, but planning also involves applying for the necessary permits for in-water work from the Ontario Ministry, from conservation authorities, and sometimes from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And this process becomes easier if you've been working with them right from the beginning. They are aware of your project, so sometimes they can speed along the permitting process a little bit quicker because they understand your project and they've been involved from day one, so they know your intentions. But it can take a few months, sometimes several months, to complete and acquire official permits. So please make sure you apply early and you allow that timing in your plan. Okay, funding your project. So as I previously mentioned, you need to figure out a budget for your project and how you'll fund it. Are you going to apply for a grant, acquire donations from a local business or a sponsor? Some projects like brush bundles require more volunteer time and less money, whereas restoring a spawning bed can get quite pricey when it comes to purchasing rock or renting equipment or contractors. So a nonprofit or a charity such as Watersheds Canada has the ability to apply for grants to help fund these projects. So partnering with one of us is a great option. So get to know your local organizations and reach out to see who can help fund your project. Another great source that we have found is we've been funded by Cabela's and Bass Pro Shops. They have funding for conservation. So if you ever roll up for conservation or round up for conservation, that's where your money's going to, is projects like spawning beds. Also, ask your local contractors. You would be surprised how excited they can be to help out with a worthwhile project. The equipment and the crew you see on your screen right now were donated to us by LaVenture Construction and M. Sullivan & Son Limited. They helped us restore 3 historic walleye spawning beds on White Lake in Renfrew County. And they donated all this equipment and their crew just so that they could help out. So never be afraid to ask for help. Okay. So the 8th step in your project is a very important one, and that's communicate. Always communicate your project right from the beginning. Be open and honest about it. It's almost as important, it's more important than the work itself. Communicating and sharing what you've done is an extremely important part of the process. Funders want to know what you have done and want to be recognized for their support and contribution to your restoration. So, and community partners are equally excited to share the great news and to share the great work that they've been helping with. Being a part of a fish habitat restoration is extremely fulfilling. And it is great to know you are doing something good for your local fish and wildlife in your area. So attending AGM, this is the Mazenal Lake AGM, annual meeting of the Lake Association. We were able to communicate our projects and let people know what we've done. We also create videos. So creating videos, sending out media releases to local newspapers or news sources, local radio stations, and sharing on social media are just a few ways that you can show your appreciation to your funders and partners. So always remember to take lots of photos and video throughout the process, right from the beginning. Document your before and afters, and make sure you return to your sites to monitor the success of your projects later on. So you can, again, let people know how your project has benefited the area. So as I mentioned before, our protocols come with accompanying videos. And I know there is a lot of information that I haven't covered, but I could actually talk about each type of project for hours. So if you're looking for more details, please refer to our toolkit and our protocols. And I highly encourage you to watch the 3 videos. Each video is somewhere between 7 and 9 minutes long, and it gives an overview of what is involved with that type of project, as well as demonstrating how they can be done. These videos were created by Pine Grove Productions and are available on the Watersheds Canada website and on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you to check them out. All right. And at Watersheds Canada, we believe in sharing our resources, our expertise, and our programs. It allows us to make the greatest improvement to water health across Canada. When we teach you how to help, we give you the power to pass on that same help to others. So thank you for joining me today to learn about enhancing and restoring critical fish habitat in Ontario. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. So we actually have a good number of questions that came in. So some of them kind of overlap, so I might smoosh a couple together. And of course, if you're on the spot and some of them are a little more technical or you need some time to go away and come back, that's fine. We have everyone's email. So I'll start with some of I had 2 that actually came in about chloride. So specifically, does Watershed Canada currently test for that when you're completing your work? And as a follow-up, are there any species of fish that can handle chloride loading, especially after the winter? Is that something you could speak to, or should we do that as a follow-up?
That would be more of a follow-up. Chloride, it's not a limiting factor that I have looked at. I do have a water quality background. I know the conservation authorities do test for chloride to look at how zebra mussel shells can form if there's certain amounts of chloride in the water. But that would definitely be a question to ask your local CA, because we don't actually do a lot of water quality testing. We look and go to those experts in the government.
So like they would complete the testing first as part of your planning process, and then you can plan based off that information. Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question to go after a conservation authority to see if they test locally, because the comment mentioned that a lot of rivers in the GTA exceed the chloride standards each year. And they were just wondering what impact that might have on fish egg survival. And our answer is go to your conservation authority, ideally.
If I do find some more information, we can send out
pass it on. Okay, great. We did also get a question then. A lot of lakes are dammed within Ontario. So there were a couple questions coming in about, they'd be keen on doing some sort of like native planting within their lake, but it drops by up to 6.5 feet every fall. And kind of the same thing for the spawning beds, right? Like I could put a spawning bed in, but like the water level above the rocks is going to rise and fall depending on damming. So do you work on lakes that are dammed frequently?
Yeah, so with a dammed lake, that's where, again, contacting the ministry or the CA is really key. I know in this area, most of our dams are being operated by the local conservation authorities, and they look at, in their management plans, are specifically fish survival and fish populations and wildlife. And they look at everything from social to habitat to when they are actually lowering water levels and raising them. So they do look at spawning times. So you'll notice that the beds are not exposed during the spring when the walleye are spawning, or if it's trout, the fall, they'll wait till spawning has finished. So that's why to partner with these government agencies is key, to understand how that lake is run and how, because you don't want to just put in rock. You need to find an area that is historic and that is used, because like I said, walleye return to the same area year after year. So you're enhancing what's already there. You're not creating new habitat in that respect. But with plantings, you can pick tolerant species that will that like water, but also like drier conditions. There are native tree species that will go both ways. And having any type of tree, bush, shrub, wildflowers along your shoreline will help and stabilize that shoreline.
Okay, and then just curious, because it did come up, is there a specific depth that spawning bed rock should be covered, or is it species dependent?
It's species dependent.
Okay, fair enough. So we covered. All right, so now I'm on to my other questions. They've been coming in again as we go through. So there is. So we covered that one. Okay, so does any of Watershed Canada's work address flooding within a shoreline or riverbed? And do you ever feel like adding rock is just a band-aid solution?
Okay. Our thoughts are that planting a shoreline is key. Okay. Adding rock in some instances to a shoreline that has flooding issues can help short term, but long-term solutions are planting those trees, because the roots are going to hold that soil. So what you'll find is, yes, that that rock, the riprap, what people call it, is great at first. It will help stabilize it. But over time, the ground behind it will continue to erode away if water gets behind it. So you want to do both. If you do have to put rock in, you need to do both, and you need to plant behind it to hold it in place. We've also started planting in the rock as well. That's another form of rehabilitation that you can do. And we've been very successful with it. We've taken dogwoods and planted dogwoods right in the rock, and then put the rocks around it, and worked with contractors that way to help do both processes. That way you get both benefits. But rock, remember, do require permits. So you do need to contact your local conservation authority for those.
Great. And we did have a couple of questions come in about tree species to plant on the shoreline. I know you recommended silver maple and black willow. Those are both kind of the species that are great with wet roots. Is there any sort of resource that Watershed Canada has that has a more complete listing of riparian appropriate trees and plants?
Yeah, on our website, if you go to the Natural Edge program, we actually have a native plant database. So you can put in everything about your property. You can put if it's dry, if it's shaded, if it's sunny, if they're wet, whatever it is, and also where you live. And you can get native species for that area. So we don't have a complete list yet across Canada, but we are working to improve it every year. So you can check those out. I did see a question in the chat asking about eastern white cedar and white pine. Those are great too. Again, they like more of a drier, eastern white pine likes wet, but eastern cedar likes wetter areas. Pine likes drier, more acidic soils. But what we were going for with the silver and the willow is they have large canopies. So they will lean across the creek and create shaded area, a larger shaded area, and they are extremely fast growing.
Yes, yeah, I know that it's a slightly different environment, but Forest Ontario always talks about the right tree in the right place. So, you know, trees can't go just anywhere if you want them to thrive. And depending on what you want out of that tree, you want a different species.
Exactly.
I heard, Melissa, that there is maybe a new fish habitat project working on washing trout spawning beds that maybe you could talk about.
Yes, so this year we are piloting a new type of project, and we have been working with a lake up in Renfrew County that has a historic lake trout spawning bed, and it has been diminishing over the last 7 years. And the populations have been dropping, and it's been monitored by the ministry. And we've been asked to go in and give them a hand. So last fall, we acquired some equipment. We borrowed from the local Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and we got a hose and we got brooms. And we actually scrubbed a trout spawning bed. We scrubbed all the rocks, got all the silt off of them. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be adding more rock to this spawning bed on the ice, like I showed earlier. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to help this historic lake trout lake recover. And we'll be monitoring it for the next couple of years. We're hoping that this will be another protocol that we can add to our toolkit. So we're just right now piloting it and testing it on a few lakes and seeing where we go from there.
And I assume you have a lot of community partners then, so lake associations. Okay.
Yeah, lake associations, fish and game clubs, obviously government agencies are going to be key in this one. Cold water is monitored really specifically by the government agencies, and you have to be very careful about what you do on them because it is a precious resource and there's fewer and fewer in the areas.
Okay. Do you happen to have any French versions of your resources? That came up and I wanted to flag it before it happened, before it runs by me.
Not yet. We are looking into having things translated right now. Unfortunately, it is just English. Sorry about that, but hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have things translated.
Okay. And I think we have time for a couple more. So there's a few I'm seeing. Before I get into them, I am just cutting and pasting that survey into the chat. So everyone, we really encourage you to take a few minutes to fill it out. It's extremely helpful for us. But we do have a question about restoration recommendations for high sediment loads. So that participant was wondering if the wood bundles and the riparian restoration address those high sediment loads, or if there were additional restoration techniques you would use.
Again, it's hard to know without being at the site because everything is so site specific. But like I mentioned, brush bundles do reduce sediment in certain areas. So they are helpful in that regard as well. It would definitely be something you need to talk to someone about. And we'd have to look at it a little closer. I can't give really recommendations just off the cuff, but yeah, they do help with sediment for sure.
Essentially what you're saying is the restoration is really site dependent. Is it the fact that there's no planting? Is it the fact that there's like a lot of boating and wake issues going on? That's all going to affect sedimentation and then also affect your restoration.
Yeah, and what we do find too is a lot of times people are actually pulling weeds, I don't like that word, aquatic vegetation out of the lake to make swimming areas and stuff, and that makes the sediment worse. So you do need to leave some.
So then there's questions about runoff, but again, that's going to be site dependent then. Probably frequently if it's runoff, there's issues with not enough plants buffering the waterway. If there's anything else you'd like to add to a runoff remediation, you could do so now.
Runoff plants for sure. You do want to have a planted area, especially if you have a steep slope. The other thing is curving pathways, like I mentioned. Anything that's paved will just run straight. So having curved pathways, things that are permeable, whether it's wood chips along your pathway, so things trickle in and filter before they hit. Also creating rain gardens. That's another great idea. You can have near, if you have a downspout and your water's running off, create a little garden there and it'll catch the rain and it'll water your plants for you, and you've got a beautiful area, and it prevents runoff there too.
Okay. And I have one last question for you then. I think we've actually hit every one that came in. I did have one participant ask specifically about ravine waterways and if they have different importance versus the other waterways you work on.
I haven't worked on any ravines, but yeah, of course they would have a different parameters as well, because they're wet at one part of the year and dry in another. So I guess it would just depend on that particular area, the slope. and what you're trying to do, what your objective is for the project.
Yeah, no, that seems totally fair. So then, Melissa, thank you for your expertise and taking all those questions. There was definitely a good number. We appreciate the engagement. Like I said, there is the survey in the link or in the chat, so please do take a few minutes to fill it out. It'll be helpful both for us, Ontario and Watershed Canada.